Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Cunningham. I'm Executive Director of Oxford University's North American office based in New York. And on behalf of my colleagues throughout the University of Oxford community, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, our latest webinar. I'm pleased to say that I'm speaking to you from our offices at 500 Fifth Avenue. My colleagues and I have been back at our desks for quite some time, but last week we were able to hold our first in-person event in over 2 years. Our new Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor David Gann, was here in New York, and about 50 alumni and friends gathered with us to welcome him and hear a little direct news from Oxford. We also streamed those remarks, and so people were able to participate in this first hybrid event, and we were quite pleased with the results. Having said that, we're also enormously gratified with the response that our alumni and friends, not just in the United States, but around the world, have provided through these webinars. It's difficult to say that there is a silver lining to a pandemic, but certainly the way our alumni have embraced this format and have stayed in touch with Oxford and the important work that is being done across the university has been, again, very gratifying to see. It's interesting to note that I believe this is our 7th webinar that in some way relates to the research and work being done in Oxford related to climate change. And I think it gives a good example of just how broad this work is and its depth and breadth. It's something certainly I find reassuring to know that so many talented and gifted people in Oxford are working on this enormous challenge. The topic today, or a title for our topic today, is the implications of COP26 for progress on climate change, clean technologies, and pulling CO2 out of the air. And our format is a Q&A with Professor Cameron Hepburn. Before I turn the proceedings over to our moderator, just a little bit of housekeeping. This session will last about an hour. Some people have already submitted questions, and our moderator may go to those initially, but I would encourage you to submit other questions through the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And our moderator will do her best to select the most interesting and challenging ones to share with Professor Hepburn. Speaking of our moderator today for this session is Professor Gillian Rose. Gillian Rose is a professor of human geography at the University of Oxford and the current head of the School of Geography and the Environment. She's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Academy of Social Sciences and is also a best-selling author. Although sadly, her primary book is a textbook explaining visual research methods to social scientists, so maybe a little hard to find in your local bookshop. Having said that, the 5th edition of Visual Methodologies will be out, published by Sage in 2022. She is an enthusiastic advocate for geography as the discipline with the interdisciplinary research necessary, both to address the world's most pressing challenges and to identify pathways to change. Her own work focuses on how digital technologies are changing everyday experiences of cities. So like Professor Hepburn, she also examines a pivotal moment of change that we are all living through. So at this point, I'd like to hand the proceedings over to Professor Gillian Rose.
Thank you, Michael, and a very warm welcome to everyone to this event this evening. I'm broadcasting from Oxford, the very place, and it's a pleasure to be doing so. I'm sure many of us, of course, have been following both COP26, but also tracking very extensive media coverage and our various engagements with climate change as one of the most challenging issues facing us all globally right now. And I think it's also, it's challenging on many different ways, but I think also I certainly find it a difficult thing to get my head around. I think partly because it demands a really wide range of kind of understanding and engagement. So there's a sort of imperative to understand both certainly something of the science behind climate change, sciences of the atmospheres, the oceans, of ice, and so on. But I think as COP26 actually demonstrated rather brilliantly, clearly climate change is also deeply political, economic, even a kind of cultural phenomenon, thinking about the kind of values that different people bring to the crisis and the kind of stories that are told about it. And as Michael perhaps indicated, with his permission and Cameron's, I would just like to make a few comments about geography as a discipline that's really very well suited to trying to engage with that breadth of this complex problem that we're facing, particularly because geography is not a subject that's as well established in universities in the US as it is elsewhere in the world. So maybe there's a little value in just explaining what this slightly perhaps sort of arcane discipline actually is and does. So geography, I think, is unique as a subject in that it brings together both social sciences and natural sciences. It straddles both those knowledge domains. And I think that means that uniquely it really does place it as the discipline that has that breadth, but also an understanding of the kind of really deep relationships between those two domains. And that's the kind of knowledge we need right now, between the social and the environmental, or the natural and the human, you know, however you'd like to frame it. And geography as a university discipline, I think, is really you know, exceptionally important right now, certainly because of the research that we do into really understanding science, social science, and the interrelations of those things, particularly around climate change, but also other major, you know, global challenges, biodiversity loss, pandemics, many others. But also, of course, as a university subject, teaching is the core of what we do. And certainly some of my own engagements around some of the activities around COP26, clearly there's so much energy, commitment, advocacy coming from young people. And I think certainly yeah, all institutions of education, you know, should also ensure that that energy and advocacy is really informed and in their interrelationality. And geography as a discipline also has a really strong history of bringing that knowledge, that research to the real world, and engaging with partners, non-academic collaborators, partners of all kinds. Sometimes that history has been a little problematic, but I think right now that mission to be in and of the world and engage with it is absolutely critical. So that's enough of the blurb, but it does give me a rather, I hope, a rather lovely segue into introducing our speaker for this evening, because I think Cameron actually exemplifies exactly that range of skills and expertise and engagement that I've just been describing. Although I think actually he doesn't have any geography training as such, so perhaps a geographer in spirit rather than in a necessary sort of institutional background. But Professor Cameron Hepburn is Professor of Environmental Economics at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment, which is one of the research centres associated with the Department of Geography at Oxford. And his educational background is broad, to put it mildly. It spans law, French philosophy, chemical engineering, and a PhD in economics. He's an eminent academic whose academic work has very wide reach and impact, both among other academics, but also across businesses, foundations, governments, and so on. He's been bringing exceptional leadership skills to the Smith School over the last few years as its director. He's the co-founder of 3 startups, and as perhaps you might guess from that profile, he was also exceptionally busy through COP26, engaging in a whole range of activities, particularly focusing on the economics of climate change. For example, one of many working with the China team from Tsinghua University at Chatham House. So I really think there are very few people better placed to take us through COP26 and explore its processes, its implications, perhaps even its limits. And I'm really delighted to hand over to him now. And please don't hesitate to add your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to engage with them later. So Cameron, over to you.
Thanks, Gillian, for the very kind, possibly overly generous introduction, although you're quite right, I do need to do a degree in geography. I feel my inferiority on a bit of a daily basis in the school. But anyway, hopefully it won't prevent me from saying something interesting and useful for you today. So I wanted to, as Michael said, just kind of briefly, before we get into the conversation, because that's always the more interesting bit, as we all know too well. Just take you through some of the key implications, at least as I see them, of the conference that's just finished. Before I do that, just quickly, the Smith School has as its focus these kind of challenges. How do we get to net zero emissions and do that while achieving sustainable development, and realizing that actually business, enterprise, and many different kinds of organizations are going to be on the front line. And we have just launched a new master's program. We've now got, Gillian mentioned leadership. You know, Oxford has been creating leaders for hundreds of years. Doubtless many of you, if not all of you, are in that category of Oxford trained leaders. And we need a new generation of leaders who are equipped with this combination of the physical and the social sciences to tackle the biggest environmental challenges, of which climate, sadly, is only one. Anyway, so let me very briefly summarize where I think we are, and then get into the discussion. I'm slightly intimidated by the questions that have already been asked, let alone the ones to come. So, was COP a success or a failure? It's the question I always get asked. I've been asked, you know, if I had a pound for every time I've been asked that, I'd be wealthy now. And I think the answer is it's just part of the journey, yeah. And it's wrong to see, you know, it's often built up, these meetings are built up as the last chance to save the world. And of course, you know, I understand why people do that. It's not actually true. So where are we on the journey? Well, before Paris, the Paris conference in 2015, business as usual was said to take us to 4 to 6 degrees of warming. I have to say, personally, I never bought those projections for reasons that you'll probably understand later. But nonetheless, that was a widely shared view that and there were conferences on what a 4-degree warming world looked like. And after a few of them, people decided we didn't want to think about that anymore. In Paris, we got the world to agree to limit temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius. The Americans amongst you, I know you've got to do a bit of translation there, and to pursue efforts to keep temperatures actually to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And it was recognized for the first time at Paris in an international agreement that this required net zero. That language wasn't used. It was a balance between sources and sinks, but that's what it meant. But the drawback of Paris was that when it came to the crunch and all the countries submitted their what were called intended nationally determined contributions, what a mouthful, their pledges basically, that added up to 3 to 4 degrees of warming. So we needed to ratchet up the ambition and actually start to show some action. And in Glasgow, you know, we didn't get to 1.5 degrees, it's been widely reported. But we're now at 2.4 degrees. So you can see that as a massive failure, as many NGOs do, and clearly it's not enough. But if you compare it to where we have been, there's considerable progress here. And a few years ago, we didn't have net zero targets, barely at all. You know, 10% of the economy was covered by net zero targets. And now we're talking about 80% of the world, the global GDP, is under a commitment to reach net zero emissions around the middle of the century, between 2040, 2060, thereafter, I guess 2070, including India. So there's a lot of work to be done still. At Egypt at the next meeting and in between. And just to really emphasize how far away we are from where we need to be, this kind of chart up here from Climate Action Tracker does that. You can see where the current pledges and targets for 2030 and the totality take us at the point, let me show you with the cursor here at 2030, and where we would ideally be by that point in time. So this is the decisive decade. The ambition gap is very large, and that's before we talk about the actual delivery gap, because what countries say they're going to do isn't necessarily what they actually do. Now, with that in mind, the UK presidency of the meeting did a series of kind of side deals. Ended up being a bit of a pick and mix at COP, with various countries in some and not others and so on, but we had deals on cars and the phasing out of the internal combustion engine from road transport, you know, in various countries by 2030, 2035, 2040, and 6 big car manufacturers joined that deal. We had a deal on coal, both, you know, phase outs, 46 countries, and of course the big tear-shedding moment of China and India insisting on phasing down rather than out coal. But as John Kerry said, and I think he and Americans and Europeans were right to just say, fine, have your phase down, we'll come back and we'll get phase out next year. Because coal's only going one way, and that's into the trash can. And I can say a little bit more about that for those coal-loving Americans listening in. Be very happy to debate with you on this topic. It's always good to have a fierce debate when you've got truth on your side. On the cash side of things, 100 billion by 2020 was what was pledged in 2009. We still haven't delivered that for poor countries. But in a sense, the big issue is, can we deliver the trillions, not the odd 100 billion, the trillions of required cash in investment to transform, frankly, we rewire our economy. And as our founder, Sir Martin Smith, says, this is perhaps the greatest opportunity for capitalism since the Industrial Revolution. We had deals on trees, deals on technology, and I'll say a bit more about technology in a moment, because that's, I think, possibly one of the most underappreciated but important elements here, and a pretty big deal led by the Americans and the Europeans on methane. Okay, so that's kind of where we are, 2.4 degrees. We need 1.5. We're a long way off. You saw the gap there. Is there any hope? And I want to just very quickly take you through, slightly idiosyncratically, why I still feel that it's realistic to think that we could get to 1.5 degrees. People have thought I've been crazy for some time here, but let me explain why I think you can't rule it out. So the conventional narrative here is that this is very difficult. It's a global commons problem. It's externalities, for those of you who've done any economics. It's going to be slow, it's going to be expensive, nobody's going to agree, we're going to have to cut economic growth, populations that keep growing, we will love our flights and our prosperity, nobody wants to cut energy usage, nobody wants higher electricity prices, and it's going to be hugely expensive to take all this CO2 out of the air. So, forget it, it's not going to happen. And if you take the International Energy Agency's projections, even their sustainable development scenario shown here, in the middle panel, has electricity from clean sources here in blue as being, if you're generous, around 30% of the global final energy mix. But what I want to draw your attention to is that those sorts of projections are based on these sorts of projections here on the left of costs of clean energy. Now, this is a slightly taxing graph to put up for alumni, but you are Oxford alumni, your brains are good. They may not be as young as they were when you were at Oxford, but they're good. So I'm going to have a go anyway. This is a log scale. So what that means is every big gap here is a factor of 10 down. So you go from here to here, and you're reducing your costs by 90%. So if you take the IEA's forecast of where solar energy would be today in 2000, it thought we'd be up here, and in fact, we're down there. It was wrong by a factor of 10. Now, a factor of 10 is not a small number to be wrong by when you're thinking about energy prices. Don't know how many of you follow the oil markets, but it's not that often that you go from $100 a barrel to $10 a barrel. So these forecasts have been dramatically wrong, and not just wrong, 1 year, they're wrong year on year on year on year, but yet they form the basis of our projections about the energy mix into the future. Some work we've done at Oxford recently is to take the past data and say, look, let's just suppose all we had to go on was the past data. Let's make a set of forecasts based on that data. Let's see how wrong those forecasts are. So let's imagine we're in 1990, knowing what we know up to 1990, make a forecast, see how wrong it is, and then we can forecast the error in our forecasts. That gives us this kind of projection of costs for solar. Stick them into your big energy model, and you find that clean electricity is 80% of the global final energy, not electricity, the whole shebang, energy mix by 2040 on an economic cost basis. That led us to write recently in the Washington Post and in Bloomberg, going big and fast on renewables would save trillions in energy costs, 26 trillion to be precise. So, okay, slightly idiosyncratic detour, but I think possibly the most important underappreciated feature about the transition to a net zero economy. So where to next? Look, I think I had a call this morning with colleagues in Australia, which is where I was from originally. I was an Aussie Rhodes Scholar, and the sense there is that even though the Australian government just simply cannot seem to get this, the business community and the financial community knows that the time is up on the fossil sector. Nobody wants to be financing or expanding their coal plants, or even to some degree gas. And we've seen a massive cancellation of coal-fired generation in Asia coming. And I feel like the drivers of civil society and the financial community and the business community are now going to keep pushing this forward, and government will come along too. So it's not going to be straightforward, not necessarily next year, but in the next few years, we'll be at the point where there is net reductions of coal on the grid. And then finally, I'd say something about pulling CO2 out of the air. The UK government, along with the Americans again, and the Germans, have all launched big programs to start to explore the different pathways, both industrial and nature-based pathways, to take CO2 out of the air. Because even with the best will in the world, we're going to have to be doing this in the middle of this century. And unless we start to get the science and the tech and the engineering done now and the costs down, we won't be able to scale it up to the level that's required. I mean, what we're talking about here is something akin to the global oil and gas industry, except functioning in reverse and functioning using natural methods as well as industrial methods. So this chart here shows the UK's projections for how it gets to net zero by 2050. We have to be doubling the removals of CO2 into peat land, wetland, into forests, into rewilding and regenerating our ecosystems. And we also need to be scaling up what's called direct air capture, carbon capture and sequestration methods, and bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration methods. So let me end it there, because I don't want to go on too long. And as I say, the discussion is always the fun bit. And hand back to Gillian to open the question.
That's brilliant, Cameron. Thank you very much. That's actually really quite cheering. I believe you. I want to believe you around the possibilities for positive change. That was great. Michael's right, Zoom is a wonderful thing. One of its frustrations, though, is actually being able to show appreciation. You don't get that warm glow of a round of applause after a lovely presentation. So, but I'm sure, let's do it virtually. We're thanking you collectively. Thank you, Cameron. So we had quite a lot of pre-submitted questions. Those Oxford minds are clearly very lively and engaged around this particular issue. And I think some of the questions we have in advance, you actually answered really, you answered very directly in your talk. So, did we keep 1.5 alive? Will governments have enough to take action? In your opinion, will the global average temperature rise by no more than 1.5 degrees? I think it's on life support, I'd say. not alive and kicking, but not dead. Yeah, but there's a sense in which the possibility of at least keeping near to 1.5 is certainly it's not a completely dead loss. So maybe I could turn to some of the questions that were more directly focused on COP26 itself as a kind of process, I suppose, about effectively or not achieving change. So I suppose that there was one question around perhaps what were you surprised by at COP26? Was there anything that you perhaps weren't expecting that came out from it that perhaps had a more positive effect than you were anticipating? Yeah, I mean, the thing that surprised me most was a session that I was in, actually, that you referred to. It was convened by Chatham House, and it was joint with Oxford and Tsinghua, so it's Chinese-UK work. And the Chinese work, which I hadn't seen until then, was looking at the economic consequences, the damages of climate change on the Chinese economy. Now, obviously, there's some good economists that have been doing work in China for a long time on these sorts of questions, and they need the answers as much as anybody else, more. But the Tsinghua team had found, kind of, as it were, behind the sofa, an extra 134 trillion US dollars of damage from climate change on the Chinese economy if they didn't act. Now, I'm not sure that's kind of fully percolated into the Chinese policymaking machinery and negotiating machinery yet.
it doesn't surprise me in the sense that we've known for decades that the impact on China from climate change was going to be huge, just because of the physical geography, the location of its cities, the location of its deserts, where people get their water from. The Himalayas melting doesn't leave you with a lot of water for several hundred million people. Major impacts on productivity from heat stress, which they've now priced and put numbers on. And of course, there are huge gains on the flip side, on the air pollution side. So that was probably the most exciting positive fact that I acquired from wandering around the Blue Zone, as it's called. Possibly the most interesting interaction with, over here we have a protest group called Extinction Rebellion. I'm not sure whether they've gone global yet, but they're pretty extreme. They occupied Greenpeace on the grounds that Greenpeace were not extreme enough. And so I was engaged by Extinction Rebellion protesters in the corridors. And I had a very interesting conversation with them. They were properly keen on understanding the tech, the economics. And I came away from that thinking, with renewed respect for some of the people out there on the street, even if they're engaged in semi-disobedient forms of protest, they're not necessarily uninformed.
Great, thank you. And we actually have quite a lot of questions coming around particular forms of technology and so on, and perhaps we can move on to those in a moment. But I mean, Extinction Rebellion, you're right, they are very radical, and they don't have much respect for current organisations and institutions, right? They are disruptive here in the UK. So they chain themselves to buildings, they destroy, have sit-ins on motorways and so on. They're really very activist. And of course, one of the things we heard around COP26, and I heard some young people at a demo here in Oxford say it was COP26 is just blah blah blah, right? That it is just this talking shop. It doesn't really matter what these fancy calculations by economists with respect, actually the interests, that's not really where the power lies. So do you have a sense, and a couple of the questions are really pressing about the sort of limits to COP and what might be done outside of the COP framework, perhaps keeping that sort of sense of global scale though, as the field of action.
Well, no, I've been a bit of a skeptic of these processes for some time, but I'm not to the, we convened at Oxford a debate about whether we should get rid of them. Are they worse than useless because they're distracting? And the analogy was drawn to Munich, 1938, where, we declared peace in our time only to have Hitler invade and ignored the mathematics, came out of the conference, declared success, and on we marched towards World War. I don't think it's that bad, because these conferences do, as I say, they're a stepping stone on a journey. We're much better off now than we were several years ago in terms of the mobilization of resources, of technology, etc. It's not to defend where we are. I mean, goodness, we're in a mess. There's no doubt about that. So I have huge empathy for those protesters. But I don't think they're worse than useless. And the point about deals outside the COP is very important. So I don't think these are either or. We absolutely must continue to have diplomacy and deals of all kinds happening alongside it's too important to rely on the UN process alone. And I hope Claire Perry, who is an Oxford alum, won't mind me sharing something she said to me at the COP. She was COP president before Boris decided to replace her with Alok Sharma. She said, we the UK was really taking this as the opportunity to play. And that's why there are all these side deals that were announced one day after the next to get these coalitions of the willing with different configurations working on solving the problem that were kind of outside the UN process, but parallel to it.
Right. So I guess that's almost a kind of different model of change, I suppose, rather than some big global collective statement by, actually, we've got, as you say, rather pick and mix approach, but actually maybe that's progress where it can be made in a much more sort of pragmatic manner. In fact, there is one question comes through in the Q&A, which I guess is one of the side effects of that pick and mix approach. Martin Rota is asking about whether the sorry, let me get that. Whether global methane emissions, much of it apparently comes from Russia. Did the Russians agree to methane reductions?
Yeah, so you're quite right that the problem with the pick and mix is that, of course, the big players with the most to lose from any of these specific deals didn't join them. And so Martin's spot on, unless my memory is failing me, the Russians were one of the countries that didn't join the methane deal. I guess no surprises there. And when you add up the effect of all of these side deals, it's much less than it might seem, precisely because of the effect Martin's identified. But it's not nothing. 2.2 billion tons is the estimated impact of the side deals from climate action.
Right, thank you. So I can see a question from Stephanie Stringer, who's asking about kind of questions of justice and ethics, which I would like us perhaps to move on to before we wrap up, absolutely. But we did also have a lot of pre-submitted questions that were really focusing on the kind of possibilities of technological fixes and different kinds of technological fixes and how to get those working in place and acting, and indeed natural fixes as well. So perhaps one of the more general questions was to invite you to comment on the current state and viability. This is quite a big question, Cameron. Okay. The current state and viability of carbon sequestration technologies in general, and then we've got a bundle of questions that want, what some specific kind of technologies perhaps that we could discuss. So you have a general sense first of all.
Sure, no, it's a very important question. Where we are is that there's a set of kind of techniques, I won't call them technologies, that are very well established, widely in deployment right now, very cheap. And they are the nature-based processes, planting trees or not cutting them down, changing the way we manage soil, using biochar, rewilding, restoring peatlands or managing peatlands and wetlands. All of these approaches are incredibly low cost for the amount of carbon that you save. The problem is not about the economics, because if you have a look at it, we're not doing them right now, even though there are many instances they're negative costs. You actually get better fertility, you get better, you get other side benefits that mean that the carbon costs are effectively negative. And yet we're deforesting. And yet we're to use technical language, we're screwing this up quite royally. So to the human geographer in you, Gillian, I kind of feel like I need to pass the baton here to say clearly the economists don't have a lot to contribute on the narrow question of, because it's not a matter of making these things cheaper. It's a matter of understanding the questions of livelihoods and rights and Indigenous expectations about culture and so on. There's not to say there isn't any economics here. A big driver of deforestation is ranching and meat production, effectively. So, the food system has a lot to answer for. But yeah, so there's a category around natural-based solutions that are tried and tested. We know they work. We need to do them, but getting them done at scale is a more social, anthropological set of questions. Then there's the more industrial approaches, so directly capturing CO2 from air with chemicals, with amines, and then concentrating it and storing it. Now, they work. We know they work. So there are various plants in Switzerland, one in Iceland just started. There's no reason they can't work at scale, but they're currently very expensive per ton. So personally, I just bought some carbon direct captured and then mineralized, so bound up in rock. So it's not going anywhere. You're absolutely guaranteed to have bought an offset that you can rely on. And it cost me $1,200 per ton. So they're kind of eye-wateringly expensive at the moment. And part of what our research program is looking at is how do we simultaneously bring down the costs of these technologies and make sure that our politicians and our publics have appropriate sets of information about their full effects so we can make good decisions about whether and how and where and when we want to scale up these technologies.
Great, thank you. So I'm trying to If I'm looking slightly distracted, I apologise. I'm trying to look at the Q&A is very lively coming through, and I'm trying to keep up with both. So that was really helpful. I mean, there was certainly a lot of interest in what are the prospects for natural methods of carbon sequestration, and I think you've just answered that. Quite a few questions wanted to know about nuclear power. Whether nuclear energy is going to enable us to achieve carbon and temperature goals. I don't know if you have any views about that.
Yeah, I mean, nuclear is always, you can't have one of these sessions without the nuclear issue coming up. And I think, so a few things to say. The first is that if you do the same sort of cost projections that we've done on solar and wind and batteries and electrolysis and so on, hydrogen production, if you look at them for coal and oil, they're flat. I mean, they've gone nowhere in 100 years. You get up and downs, quite big up and downs in some cases in fossil fuel prices. You do it on nuclear, sadly, the trajectory is upwards. So it actually costs more as time passes. Now that may change. There's several companies in the States, NuScale among them, Rolls-Royce in the UK, looking at small modular reactors that have, the promise to bring down the costs. We'll see whether that can be delivered. So what I think, unless you get this dramatic decline, and even if you get this dramatic decline in costs, it's unlikely to compete effectively with renewables at massive scale. That's not to say it doesn't have a very important role in the solution, because many countries have very large nuclear fleets. If you were to retire them, certainly right now, you'd be in a big problem, because we're not quite ready on the storage side with hydrogen production or battery production to scale up solar and wind to near 100% of power grids. So maintaining existing nuclear fleets, replacing the nukes as they come off the grid, probably with more nukes. And China has a nuclear program which is making very important contributions. So I think it's, I don't like to be religious about nuclear, either kind of a believer or non-believer, but fairly brutally pragmatic about it. And, the scale of the role it plays is going to be determined by, how successfully we can just replace like on the one hand, and whether these small modular reactors come down in cost very dramatically, which I guess I'm a bit skeptical about, but I'm open-minded.
Thank you. I guess we're moving a little bit away from sequestration technologies, but a couple of questions in the live Q&A and advance. We're interested in hydrogen as a fuel, but I must admit my only understanding of hydrogen comes from some of the science fiction I read, where it's often cited as this magic fuel. Could you tell us a little bit about hydrogen? So I think somebody's talking about blue and green emissions with carbon capture and so on. Just talk us a little bit through that. That seems to be maybe perhaps a less familiar technology to at least some of us.
Yeah. I prefer to think of hydrogen as an energy carrier because it's the bond between the two hydrogen atoms has a lot of energy in it. And so when you produce hydrogen, which you can do in a variety of ways, you're effectively injecting energy into it, and then you can take it out later when you need it. The merit of it as a carrier is, of course, it doesn't have a carbon atom in there. It's just hydrogen atoms. So when you use it, when you combust it with oxygen, you get water, H2O, out the back end. A similar sort of energy carrier, which some people bundle up with hydrogen, is ammonia, which is got one nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. So it's a little bit like methane, which has got a carbon and 4 hydrogens, but it doesn't have the carbon bit. And 80% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen. So in principle, it can be neutral to the atmosphere. So what's the role of hydrogen? Well, it can be produced from water. And when you use it, it gives you water at the back end. So it is effectively a clean vector if you're using solar and wind or other renewable electricity to split the water in the first place to produce the hydrogen molecules. And that's called green hydrogen. There's a different way of producing hydrogen from natural gas, where you take the methane molecules, and so the CH4, you effectively take the hydrogen out, you get carbon dioxide emitted. So you've got to capture the CO2 or else you're just making things worse. And then you've got to store and bury the CO2, and that gives you hydrogen from natural gas as a feedstock. Now, the problems with that sort of hydrogen, which is blue hydrogen if it's so named because the sequestration will often be offshore under the ocean. The problem with that is that you can have leaks in the pipelines along the way, and you're still fundamentally using carbon from the lithosphere, from the Earth, and some of it is going to end up in the atmosphere. So it's not entirely a closed loop. The reason people are talking about it is because that form of hydrogen at the moment is cheaper than hydrogen using renewable energy from splitting water. But all the signs are that that's going to change probably within a decade, if not perhaps earlier, because the costs of your renewable energy inputs keep coming down, as I said, and the cost of the bit of equipment, the electrolyzer that splits water, is coming down as well as scientists work on that. So green hydrogen is getting cheaper by the year.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. So this is a great example of that mix of the kind of science and the understanding of the economics. So, but I think what's something I'm picking up from your various questions, various answers, is that the sometimes economics in terms of kind of incentives and price drops kind of work to drive change. But in the context of nature-based solutions, for example, they really don't seem to.
Right.
Which perhaps again, perhaps a sort of segue into the sort of another grouping of questions that we've had. Again, a lot of comment. I apologise. There's a lot coming through on the Q&A. I can't even read them, let alone try and engage with them and gather them together. I apologise. I think we definitely need more of these meetings, Mike, for these alum. But there's definitely a bunch of questions coming around that do focus more, I guess, on the kind of politics of this, and in particular the ways in which this plays out very differently in different places, and certainly some questions around perhaps possibly especially for nature-based solutions, potentially that there are questions of kind of the sort of local communities that often occupy the land that is being nature-based solutioned, possibly without their participation, agreements, or even sort of continued presence. Somebody in a Q&A pointing out that obviously Indigenous peoples and so on have many representatives at COP26. Perhaps to bring us back to COP for a moment, did you feel those voices were heard? Were they audible, but then were people really genuinely listening and acting in relation to those communities' concerns?
Well, I think had the final few moments been different of COP, there probably would have been a greater degree of satisfaction around the voices of Indigenous people and from vulnerable countries. There was definitely a sense that India and China did a bit of steamrolling right at the end in phasing down rather than out of COP. But in terms of the physical presence, there were lots of Indigenous groups there physically in various groups making their voices heard, or at least, well, the voices were there in the rooms and in the various spaces around COP. I mean, I think it is always a challenge. One of the nice things about the UN process, which is why I think we can't lose it, is it does give a forum for, because it requires some sort of consensus and unanimity. A kind of democratic legitimacy that perhaps you don't get in the G20 or the G2, or when it's just the OECD and rich countries trying to take action and make progress here. Having said that, I don't think it's a perfect process, but then I'm not sure how it can be any different. I'm perhaps not the one to ask about how power plays out in these sorts of fora, but it is hardly surprising, I suppose, that America and China and India and so on end up having greater say, greater power, even in a United Nations-based process, for better or worse.
And I guess both smaller nations and Indigenous peoples lack, I guess, both political capital power and also, of course, economic power, I guess, as well, to intervene in those processes, pulling those sorts of levers. Another question that came through that I was particularly interested in was around the sorts of different kinds of sort of narratives around climate change. I know this is perhaps not something perhaps you're necessarily directly involved in as a researcher, Cameron, but certainly as someone engaged in COP26. There are different narratives and discourses around The actual question was around sort of activist groups and groups within the blue zone. But I'm getting a sense that actually COP26 is actually really quite a complicated organisation, just in terms of kind of groupings and interest groups and stakeholders, and as you say, the sort of different sorts of power that were at work in the event. Can you tell us a little bit about your sense about the sort of different kinds of narratives and how they might align up with those different sort of stakeholder groups?
Yeah, I mean, it is a cacophony of different voices and interest groups and positions and lenses. You know, the economic lens is far from the only relevant one. Cultural lenses, people's livelihoods, indeed entire nations at stake in these discussions. So ways of life. It's a major change for humanity to go from the world we're in to the world we need to be. It's a major threat to, you know, the way of life of Saudi Arabia or Russia, as much as it is existential for some of the Pacific Island nations. So it is very hard to get your head around all of these different perspectives and views, and I'm not going to pretend to at all. I mean, I'm a mere humble, you know, economist. I mean, in the sense that I mean that quite genuinely, in the sense that you know, Keynes said that it would be better if economists thought of themselves rather like dentists, and I think he might have been right. And just so not by which I mean we are here to do useful thinking and useful analysis of what sort of costs and benefits and economic transformational dimensions and policies that might help us to get there, but there are a whole range of other, in a sense, more important questions about identity, national identity, about political power and so on, that are playing out in these discussions, about which, you know, economists could speak with care, I dare say.
And just to add in another layer of complications, quite a few of the questions, I guess, are also around just how the answers to all solutions to climate change are going to vary depending on the kind of place you're in. So we've had a comment around California wildfires. I guess that might come both from Australia as well as California. You know, whether they're a particular kind of technological or other kinds of solutions to that particular contribution to carbon in the atmosphere. We have comments around from Canada. Again, different kinds of corporations advocating for a particular context there. Yeah, so this whole sense of it being a kind of global problem, but actually composed of lots and lots of different sorts of locals, is also, I guess, another aspect that just makes it such a challenging problem to deal with.
Yeah, although I think, you know, I think the big achievement at Paris compared to efforts at Kyoto and then at Copenhagen was to switch this from being some sort of centrally imposed top-down structure to being a bottom-up, you know, we're all in this together, tell us what you can do. So that was the Paris structure. Now, of course, on round one, when everybody did say, this is what I'll do, it didn't add up to what was needed. So you didn't get what you needed from the bottom-up process, but you couldn't get agreement top-down either. And what Glasgow's done is to say, well, let's take those bottom-up commitments from countries, you know, that's great. Do what you can to lift ambition, and even then it's still not enough. So let's broaden it out even further and get the financial community, various businesses, civil society making pledges, so that you've got multiple, as we would say, intervention points in this system, because it's not just a system, it's a system of systems with multiple changes happening across multiple different industries and sectors and ways of life. So I think the process we have, while utterly messy and chaotic, is probably the one we need to have. We just really need to keep stepping it up. Because as I showed in the chart, there's a really big gap between where we are and where we need to be.
So I think we're beginning to run a little short of time, but I think that leads me to a question. I'm again rather a large question that I'm interested in, though, is I guess and I guess this was prompted partly through, kind of looking at the pandemic as it panned out globally as well, about the kinds of leadership that are needed in these sorts of times of crisis, I guess. I get leading what, I suppose, is the obvious answer, but so this is a very general question. But there seems to be quite a lot of discussion about the kind of balance to be struck between kind of incentivizing change, between sort of frightening people into change, between a kind of justice-driven sense of change, a kind of care motive, and these also involve different kinds of sort of institutional, but I think also personal leadership, and we've obviously seen the emergence of some very charismatic individual leaders around climate change. I have to say personally, I wasn't exaggerating. I think your leadership at the Smith School has been inspirational for many people at Oxford. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about sort of leadership in times of a global climate crisis.
You're too kind, Gillian, and we're very grateful for your support. The school. I think leadership is, there are many different models of leadership, and some of them are more suited at different times and contexts than others. So partly it's about picking how how a particular country or particular institution can and should lead at a particular point in time. In all of those models of leadership, when you're undergoing transformational change of the kind that we're discussing here, it's pretty important to be strong on the vision. And it's not one vision, there are multiple different visions, but to collectively co-create a shared vision of where we can or could be heading, so that people have a sense of their role in delivering on that vision. It's also, as you were alluding to before, it's such a big and complex and difficult issue that a very inclusive kind of leadership, actually the sort that you model so well at the school, is necessary here. And as we're talking about the UN process, the reason, a good reason to stick with it is that it is a very inclusive process with a lot of inclusive leaders in it. Look, it's very difficult, but what we are seeing around the world is leadership from many different institutions. I think whether they're leaders in NGOs, leaders within government, leaders within industry, everybody in a leadership position is getting, well, not everybody, but many leaders are getting to the point of realizing that they have an important role to play. Their organization can play an important role. And actually, if they step forward and take that leadership position, they'll be rewarded by their staff and their stakeholders who will appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Cameron. Your sound was beginning to fade out there. I perhaps would just flag to the alum, though, that the University of Oxford has just launched a sustainability policy strategy, which is starting to feed through into some very clear recommendations for how we organise ourselves as an organisation to reduce our carbon footprint. So certainly, yeah, that kind of leadership is spreading, fortunately. I can see Michael has reappeared, which
yes,
may be a
I'm
hint
back, and
that we are
perfect
indeed out of
timing,
time.
just when we started to lose Cameron's audio. But just to say, wow, what a great session! As we've discovered as we do these sessions, like it or not, a good indication of whether our audience was engaged and inspired is the number of unanswered questions in the Q&A, as Gillian struggled to keep up. But again, a really good indicator of just how engaged and enthusiastic our audience was. So thank you, Cameron and Gillian, for a really fascinating discussion. Again, speaking about leadership, a clear indication that Oxford is a leader in this field and has great contributions to make. And indeed, in the years ahead, Oxford will be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And so it's something all Oxonians and everyone associated with the university, I think, can be very, very proud of. To the audience, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Please visit our website, Oxford North America, www.oxfordna.org, to look for our next session or look at your favorite social media platform to see postings from us. And again, we look forward to engaging our global alumni community through these webinars. Last but not least, I should note that we'll be putting up a slide in just a moment with contact information for the Smith School and for the Department of Geography. And many times people ask, well, what can I do to help? And I often say, well, you can cast a vote of support in support of the work, the important work that's being done in Oxford, particularly related to climate change. And a wonderful way to cast that vote is by making a gift, if you are so inclined. And there will be QR codes placed up on the screen. And as we've all learned to use QR codes much more during the pandemic. So utilize your smartphone, take a photo of the QR code, and it'll provide a link that would enable you to cast your vote in support of the important work being done on climate change at Oxford by making a gift if you so choose. But at this point, we'll end the session. And again, sincere thanks to Professor Cameron Hepburn and for Professor Gillian Rose for an excellent session. And from all of us here in Oxford, North America, thank you for joining us.